Check 1 2, check 1 2, testing. Okay. Should be getting sound. Please comment in the chat if you are hearing me well. It kind of like took a second there, but should be working from what I can tell. We are back after taking a week off. Last week was Labor Day and I was on vacation. So, yeah, that's where we were. If you are not part of our Discord community and would like to join, please send me a message on Instagram and I will send you the link. It is the best way to keep up with any updates on the channel. Sometimes I can be hit or miss about posting them here, but I'm very good about sharing them with the community on the Discord. But like I said, please hit the like button, comment in the chat, let me know you can hear me all right. Should have a good stream today. It's on a discussion between Greene and Chris Williamson. And this is... I like listening to Greene. We've talked about him before on this channel because he very much gives you a view into the establishment thinking in the physics world today, I would think. But he also is a humble participant in the mainstream physics community, and I appreciate that, even though I don't agree with him on a lot of conclusions about things involving physics. I definitely appreciate his attitude and his approach to these topics, and he's definitely got a lot of value that he can share. And Chris Williamson runs the Modern Wisdom podcast. It is very good. I highly recommend subscribing. The link to their full discussion is below. Chris Williamson does a lot of fascinating interviews with all different kinds of people. And, you can check it out. I definitely recommend it. But, good. Thank you for letting me know in the chat. So... this is the podcast that we are going to go over. It's not a new one, and it's called The Mind-Bending Physics of Eternity. This is going to touch on a lot of topics that I talk about a lot involving infinity, what is infinity, why it's not as complicated as people make it out to be, what is eternity, how to think about these types of concepts, because they are very important to understand, I think, and they are also much simpler than most people make it out to be. But the problem is that we don't really have a unified definition for these words, even if we think that we do, and you can look it up on, in a dictionary, and it will tell you a certain definition, but it doesn't always translate well to metaphysics and therefore into physics. So we're going to take a look at those definitions, and we're going to talk about them. And then I've got some clips that are lined up. But I hope everybody who was on vacation had a good vacation, a relaxing vacation last week. It is definitely necessary. Also, it is very hot in here again, so forgive me if I'm sweating or something like that throughout this. This should be one of the last weeks where it's really hot, but it's really hot. And my air conditioning is blasting full, and it's not enough. But... God bless my wife who lets me cut the air conditioning off of the rest of the house and blast it into here for my streams so I don't look insane while sweating on camera. But, so, Greene is a theoretical physicist. Here's his Wikipedia page. Brian Randolph Greene, born 1962, is an American theoretical physicist and mathematician. He was a physics professor at Cornell and Columbia. Interesting. Greene has worked on mirror symmetry relating two different Calabi-Yau manifolds, concretely relating the conifold to one of its orbifolds. Okay, I don't exactly understand what that means, but a Calabi-Yau manifold we talk about on here, about what I think that means, and it's a six-dimensional manifold structure that's talked about in string theory, and I think that it has to do with mental structures of organization of information. But we're going to talk about the main topics that they talk about in this interview, though. So, without further ado, this is the first clip. It's the very beginning.
When you realize how unlikely it is that collections of particles would come together to yield a living system called a human being, and how spectacular it is that this collection of particles called a human being can invent, manufacture notions of value and meaning and purpose, how spectacular is that?
Brian Greene.
When you realize how unlikely it is that collections of particles would come together to yield a living system called a human being, and how spectacular it is that this collection of particles called a human being can invent, manufacture notions of value and meaning and purpose, how spectacular is that?
You know, I wanted to just kind of open with that real quick, because I think that it's important to just show kind of this is the starting place of the optimistic version of physics and mainstream physics narratives, which there's two different versions of this, and I used to subscribe to this one that he is stating, which is kind of this optimistic anti-theist perspective, which is none of this is set out of judgment, like I've said before, but just trying to understand, and I very much relate to this idea. And there's the other side of this, is that of this anti-theist perspective in physics, which is the prevailing narrative, and they talk about it quite a bit in here, is that of nihilism. It leads to this pessimistic, nihilistic attitude where there is no meaning, and then there's this other side, this optimistic view, which is, it's really not, I don't even know if it's optimistic, even though it is emotionally. It's like enthusiastic is a better way of putting it. It's like interested. You're like so interested in the world that it doesn't matter whether or not there is like intrinsic meaning that is manifested in the multiplicity of sentience that we exist in and observe. And I've said on here before that, sentient singularity theory, my work in metaphysics, seems to imply that there is no meaning in a system of a singularity of sentience where there's only one being and that's it. In the universe, if you were the only one that existed in the universe, which even then you have to break down like why that is inconsistent with even my work, but that statement. But just hypothetically, if there was only one being that existed, and there was no multiplicity of sentient beings, then there would be no meaning. And that is true, according to my work. So, but it is in the multiplicity of sentience where meaning is manifested. And, but it's not invented. It is in the way that kind of he might be stating, which is that, I'm trying not to infer too much because language is complicated and messy, but just the prevailing narrative in anti-theist, in enthusiastic anti-theism, we'll call it, is that of you can make your own meaning, instead of nihilistic anti-theism, which there is no meaning. And neither one of them is correct, even though one of them is certainly more motivating than the other. Neither one is correct, and we're going to get into this a bit. Is what is the value of a certain perspective of certain theological perspective? Because he talks about it a bit in here, and I kind of disagree with what he has to say, but I appreciate and respect the way that he approaches it, even if I think he's wrong. And we're going to talk about that. As I said before, Brian Greene, I don't agree with him on a lot of conclusions, but he definitely is a humble researcher. So, I think. But this is a great question, just to kind of open this. But then Chris Williamson asks this another question that I think is I think it's great. It's a great question, even if the answer is not really given in a way that I would agree with. It's not even given in a way that I would agree with. I think it's wrong, but it is a great question, and it is an essential question to ask that is not really focused on as much as another question. But here,
predictions for the end of the universe. If the Big Bang is when time began, then when will time stop?
Well, we don't know, but there certainly are ideas that people have developed, so it's not as though we're just shooting in the dark. The most straightforward interpretation of the data and the mathematics suggests that the universe may continue to expand forever. Forever is a kind of funny concept. It's an idea where time wouldn't literally end, but en route to that eternity, everything that we know about will end. Every star will end, every galaxy, every planet. Matter itself will, according to some of our cutting-edge theories, disintegrate into a spray of more refined particles, electrons, neutrinos, that will just continue to walk through that ever-expanding cosmos. So we don't know that that's how things will end up, but if you were to ask me to place bets based on what we know today and what we've observed today, that would probably where the bulk of my money would go.
Is that what's referred to as the Big Freeze?
It is, because the universe will just continue to get ever colder as it gets ever larger. And weirdly enough, it's also referred to as the heat death. It seems to be a kind of tension between the Big Freeze and the heat death. But they're actually the same thing, because the idea is that you'll reach a kind of equilibrium where every place in the universe will come to the same temperature. And it's that equal distribution of heat that is what we refer to as the heat death. But the temperature, the common temperature, will be so low that you can also think of it as a kind of Big Freeze.
What is a way that people can wrap their heads around how far away from us that is now?
It's a tough one. I have a metaphor that I like to use when taking people on a journey toward the far future. I use the Empire State Building in Manhattan, where I envision that every floor is 10 times the duration of the previous floor in this sort of poetic representation. So the ground floor is 1 year, the next floor 10, the next floor 100. So it's an exponential scale, where 10 to the floor number is representing the year that you're on at a given floor.
Okay, so I think that this is a great question, which is, what is the end game of the universe? And but the thing about this question is that it cannot really be answered well. I don't agree with his answer for what is the end game. I think that the end game of the universe is that it replicates itself. We are inside of a being that is reproducing, like every other being that we know of, that it reproduces. And so we're inside a being that's going through an evolutionary process, a growth process, which we observe internally as an evolutionary process. And that process is it's two-parted. In sentient singularity theory, evolution is two-parted. It's not just adaptation, but it is partially adaptation. But there's more behind it than just that. But this idea of where the universe is ending up cannot be answered very well, I don't think, outside of placing within a sentient system. So what you end up with is this heat death of the universe type idea, where it's the great contraction, basically, where everything expands and expands and expands, and then eventually just reverses and then contracts again into a infinitely hot speck or something like that. And then the Big Freeze is when everything just expands and expands and expands until everything just cools to the point of freezing over. And none of this stuff, I don't think, is really it's wrong. I don't want to say it's wrong, because there's two different fields in physics. There's quantum mechanics and general relativity, and they're not the same field. We try and think of them as the same field, but they're really not. And there are two different ways of looking at things. And one of them is much more about, much more closely linked to metaphysics, and the other one is much more of an effective theory, as Eric Weinstein would put it. It's like a tool more so, and they're both, you can make, anytime you observe even a truth, even if it's a relativistic truth or a truth within only a specific context and not all contexts, it is still useful to, in a tool type of way. But it's some of it is much more about how we much more easily linked to how we navigate our universe on a physical level, and the other one is much more linked to how we navigate on a metaphysical level. And metaphysics is not taken very seriously in physics, which is why quantum mechanics is so misunderstood and also has reached a point of kind of it's hit a wall. And metaphysics cannot be complete without it being contextualized properly within a system of sentient beings, where sentience is fundamental, and therefore goals are able to be extrapolated. And it is this extrapolation of goals that allows you to actually start to understand where the universe truly came from and where the universe is truly going to. What is the purpose of this place that we are in? What is the purpose of you and me? These are not questions that are answered by, a big freeze or a heat death or even a big bang. Not saying that these narratives are physically wrong in their descriptions of what would be physically observed, but they are not relevant to actually explaining what's happening and why. They are relevant to explaining how to maneuver and make physical predictions within this system, but they are not actually giving us answers that satisfy us at all. And we might think that they do, but they actually don't. And they are the equivalent of kind of punting the... I don't even know if this is the right term, but like, what is it? Like punting the football or something like that? It's like you're just moving the goalpost. That's what it is. It's the equivalent of moving the goalpost again and again and again infinitely, so that nobody ever actually scores. And in order to look at the field in a way that the goalpost doesn't move and you can actually see them and they are fixed, then you have to get to a more fundamental viewpoint of things than a relativistic one. And anytime that you're involved in physics discussions, people are jumping between thermodynamics and relativity and quantum mechanics and acting like all of this is just the same field. And it's really not. Physics, it is tough to even argue whether or not physics is a field of explaining our fundamental reality, or should be. It might just be a field, it might be more useful to us as a field of effective theories, and then also starting to take metaphysics more seriously, but only in the recognition that it is within the context of sentience. And that is an inevitability because you're a sentient being and you know that sentience is a fundamental it is a property of the universe, and you know that more truly than you know anything else. This is missing in our physics discussions. It's missing in our scientific discussions. In fact, it is the opposite that is assumed. It is assumed that it is not a normal property of existence, even though it is the most truly known property of existence by us. And you have to acknowledge that. You can't disregard it. And I understand why. It's because we look at things like pens and we're like, this isn't a sentient being. And it's not. But that doesn't mean that matter, I don't even want to say matter, like, because I've talked about on last stream, what is matter? We don't know what that is. I've sentient singularity theory has a narrative on it that's very similar to like analytic idealism to some degree, but it's not it's kind of taken with this assumption that we know what matter is, but we don't know what consciousness is. But I would flip that, and Noam Chomsky said that, I think, as well. He said, we do know what consciousness is, we don't know what matter is. And that, I think, is true. We intuitively know what consciousness is. We don't intuitively know what matter is, and we just know that the concept is an effective theory to help us navigate the world. And so, but this, when people ask what is the origin of the universe, and people say it is the Big Bang, that's not true. That is the observed, that is a picture that is observed from within the universe of a process of a process that is happening very shortly after the start of it, or after the start of it. We don't actually know the origin in physics discussions. I would say that we do in theological discussions, but even then, we don't have those placed within a scientific narrative, which I think that you can do. You can place them in a mathematical, the metaphysics of that in a mathematical or meta-mathematical narrative, and sentient singularity theory tries to do that, and I think does so successfully. But it's not an answer to say that the cause of the universe was the Big Bang. And it's not an answer to what's the end of the universe to say a big freeze. Neither one of these is an answer. And I think that it would be an answer to say we're inside a sentient being that is replicating, and the end point is the replication of another universe within this universe through a evolutionary process that is outlined, and sentient singularity theory has an outline that may or may not be correct. But that would be an answer. Like, the end of this universe, it might not be the very end. Like, we might continue on, but the goal of this universe, the point of it is that, and or the end point, I guess, of its evolution. And to say where did the universe come from, to say sentient existence divided its beingness and put 1/3 of its being-itness into the creation of the universe, and in an intentional action in order to multiply and sentience and manifest meaning, that would be an answer if it was correct. That would be an answer to where did the universe come from. It was an intentional creation by the sentient existence by dividing its oneness of being. That, if it is correct, that would be an answer. The Big Bang is not an answer, and a big freeze is not an answer to where we are going, even if that is the observed state eventually, on a temperature basis. But that is not, it's not fundamental description, is my point. It doesn't provide us answers. It might provide us a helpful map of how to navigate physical systems within and conditions within that, within the past or the future, but it's not giving us answers. It's not. Just like a map doesn't give you answers, really. It might tell you how to navigate to the answers, but it's not really the answers. So, let's go to the chat. Please hit the like button if you are finding this content valuable, by the way. It really helps fuel the algorithm. And, comment any questions that you have in the chat, and I will try and get to them. Chris and Nick says, Chris and Eric, etc. Things have gotten interesting again. Made me wonder about how we get oversaturated with things we find interesting and have minor existential crisis, but God always provides. Yes, it is. Yeah, I started the Chris Williamson and Eric Weinstein interview. I haven't finished it yet, but it is quite good. I'm it's no secret I really like most of Eric's interviews. I think they're very good. But that's a long one, and Chris Williamson is a very good interviewer, and there's already been questions asked in that are fairly unique. So I think it's going to be a good podcast. It is so far. Sounds great. I'll be listening while I play my Zelda game. Yeah, no worries. I'm glad that to have you listening. Trusted Source says, howdy Tyler and everyone. Howdy. Growth, sustaining, and entropy. I wonder if matter and energy itself is what propels itself through a dimension we call tall. I don't know if you mean time. Okay, yeah, time. It's like a ball on a string in a vacuum. What's moving the ball along the string? Propose energy and matter. Well, we're going to get to that because they touch on it. And I do have a video. I think it's called Space-Time in the Observerse. And I am doing my best to try and describe what I think Eric Weinstein calls the Observerse. So that's not in that video. That's not my term. And it's very possible that I've got it very wrong. And I don't think I've got it very wrong on what I'm describing. It might not be what Eric Weinstein calls the Observerse, and in which case it would need its own term. But it's like a 30-minute video towards the beginning of this channel. I highly recommend watching it. It's about what is time, and we're going to get to that because it is asked by Chris Williamson. Knowing ourselves matters more than knowing any of that. Yeah, no, knowing ourselves and the creator of ourselves and the creation of the inevitable creation, like the goal of creation itself, of that creator, matters far more than the temperature 1 billionth of a second after creation. Not saying that can't be useful in any way, but it certainly doesn't give you answers. And it's like if you trying to describe like what my day is like, and if you tried to know like if you asked me what did you do today, and I was like, it was 102 out. It's very hot, so like I'm thinking about it. It's like that might help frame some things, but it doesn't tell you what I did or why. But if you knew the goal that I had going into the day, then you would be able to predict actually what I did with my day. You couldn't predict necessarily what I did with it being 102 out. You might predict what is more or less likely. Might be more likely to go to the pool than I am to run a marathon, but maybe not. Some people are crazy. But yeah. Anyways, next clip. You need the context of sentience in order to use goals in order to make predictions about the universe. And you can't make predictions without goals about the past or the future. This next clip is something that I find interesting. It comes up multiple times in this interview, and it's something that I think it was Stephen Meyer, who is very well known for being a philosopher for philosophy of science and being a philosopher, and basically trying to show that theism is true. But I actually, or not that theism is true. That's his goal, but I think he does it not well, even though I appreciate and I identify with the goal, because I think in some ways I have the same goal, but I don't think that we approach it the same way. You have to show, if you believe that theism is true, you have to show why theism is true. You can't just show that there is that anti-theistic narrative of mainstream science is missing information, which is usually what like people with the Discovery Institute or whatever it's called that he's associated with, and a lot of other people who argue for theism try and do. They'll be like, well, we don't know the origin of life. It's like, well, first of all, sentient singularity theory would completely demolish even the context of that question, and basically would would imply that the question itself is wrong and not a good question, and therefore is misleading. But you can't just be like, we don't know the origin of life, therefore God. And people will say, well, that's God of the gaps. Or like if you say, well, we can't explain the explosion of variety in the Cambrian, explosion of life and all kinds of things. But that none of that actually is arguing for God. It's arguing that there is a lack of understanding and that there could be something or someone that would explain these gaps. So people will say God of the gaps. But Stephen Meyer will say that anti-theistic mainstream scientific narratives would use time of the gaps to explain whatever it is that they can't explain. And I think that he's right on that. But nobody's winning, both of these are wrong. And I believe, it's hard to sit here and sound humble when I say things like that, but just, I don't know. Like, if I think I'm correct, then I have to just be like, yeah, I think I'm correct. But it's, you like I said before, within the context of sentience, you can state that there's goals, and then once there's goals, now we can explain things with intentional actions and goals and things like that. But here,
in terms of a governing law, will allow small energetic fluctuations to appear, disappear, and sometimes those fluctuations might be large. They're more rare if they're large, but if you have infinite time on your hands, then rare things can happen. And so rare fluctuations where particle collections and energetic collections momentarily form, stick around for some period of time and then dissipate, that can happen too en route to eternity. So if you wait long enough, some weird things can happen because weird things can fluctuate out of nothingness.
That's something I took away from reading your book.
So I don't know. That was just like, weird things can fluctuate out of nothingness. I don't know what that even means, but it is a time of the gaps argument, and part of this is that we're still stuck in relativity. Eric Weinstein talks about this all the time, and he's very right. And this is what I'm saying when we're talking about physics. Is actually it's at least two fields, and it should be more than that, or at least it should be at least two fields, is what I'm saying. But it's treated as one, and I don't really know, like, if it's a good field to use to try and explain the origins of the universe. It's probably not. You probably need theology and philosophy, aka metaphysics. I think that there's no real difference between metaphysics and philosophy that's done well. I mean, philosophy and theology and metaphysics are kind of all one in a way. But I think it's just theology is very often within the context of certain specific scriptures, which limit its language to the language of those scriptures, and I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that it doesn't allow for it to be easily reconciled with the language that's used in scientific narratives. But this is it's not actually something that we observe in our world that is consistent really with this idea of, given enough time, anything can happen, and that doesn't make sense outside the realm of sentience. If you take a bucket of sand, and you put a bunch of sand in a bucket and you just wait long enough, do you think that a brain is going to manifest in that bucket that is human, like a human brain? Like, it's not going to happen. And people will be like, well, you don't know that it might not happen. Well, neither do you. But it doesn't, nothing that we ever observed implies that is going to be the case. And it also just seems to go against physics itself. And they talk about this in this interview. is that when you start talking about entropy and what is the opposite of entropy, you could say it's evolution. And I don't mean just evolution, like I said, adaptation. There's two parts to evolution in sentient singularity theory, but it's just growth of sentience. It's the upleveling and the the creation of it's the generation of sentience, or the perpetually generated generation of sentience. But it's then there's at least two different sides to that coin as in sentient singularity theory. But it's if you're going to say things like evolution is the other side of the coin of entropy, which is what he says, and I wouldn't disagree with him, then but you also have to then look at that evolution, as far as we understand it best, seems to be in the context of sentience. And people will be like, well, no, because there's molecules and atoms and it's like, well, maybe those things are sentient. But as far as we have firsthand understanding, it seems that that evolution takes place in the context of sentience, replication and change of and the organization and ordering of the world only takes place in the context of sentience. If you don't want something to decay and you want something to grow and be built, then it takes actions by sentient beings in order to do that, always. There is no first-hand instances in which entropy, I feel like, is not winning outside of that. And even then, from God's perspective, entropy might be not just entropy the way we think of it. It might be that that's an intentional action. But we're going to get into that here. First, we need to talk about time first, but here.
An intuition about time. So the battle is to leverage that intuition and convince people that the things that they hold dear about time, some qualities are correct, but some qualities science has revealed to just not be the right way of thinking about things. So most of us have a sense that time for you, time for me, time for everybody else is basically the same. The time elapses at the same rate, regardless of what you're doing, where you are, the gravity you're experiencing, the motion that you may be executing. That's plain wrong, right? I mean, Einstein taught us. Now in 1905, what are we now, 2021 or something? So, I can't subtract, but 115, 116 years ago, he showed us in the most direct way that that's just not correct. If you're in motion, your clock ticks off time at a different rate compared to somebody who, relative to you, is at rest. If you're near the edge of a black hole, time elapses for you at a different rate compared to someone not experiencing that gravitational field. That's an extreme example. But to go back to the Empire State Building, if you're at the top of the Empire State Building, your watch is ticking off time a little more quickly than the clock of someone on the ground on 34th Street and 5th Avenue. That sounds crazy, but that is how time actually works. So I find that if you take people sequentially through these new qualities of time that are unintuitive, we haven't directly experienced them, and then explain experiments. I mean, literally, people took atomic clocks, put one on the tarmac, put one on an airplane, and flew that plane around the world. And then they compared the clocks when that airplane landed, and these incredibly precise atomic clocks did not agree. And it wasn't because the plane was kind of jostling the clock. It wasn't like, it was a smooth ride, smooth sailing. And yet, because that clock was in motion and experiencing a different gravitational field because it was up in the air compared to the clock on the surface of the Earth, gravity gets a little weaker up there, a little further from the center, the clocks ticked off time differently. There it is.
So that explains the weirdness of time. But what about it as a fundamental phenomenon? What is it? What's it doing?
Which phenomenon, sorry?
As time.
Oh, I don't know what time is. I wish I could tell you. That's the weirdest thing at all, right? So we can measure this quality of the world called time. We can measure it to incredible accuracy. And when we do that, we can reveal features of time that are unexpected, ticks off at different rates in different environments. But if you ask me, what is it that you are measuring? I don't know. I mean, people have struggled to give an answer. One answer is, well, time is that quality of the world that allows change to take place. Okay, you can sort of figure that sort of makes sense. Time is that quality of the world that ensures that everything doesn't happen all at once. Okay, yeah, kind of, but does that really fill you with a deep sense of understanding of what time itself is? It doesn't do it for me. And so I think many of us suspect that the next revolution in understanding will be one where we can finally give a deeper explanation. And there are some who suggest, and my own field, string theory, is starting to give evidence for this. Some think that part of the reason we're unable to give a real compelling definition of time is because time itself is not as fundamental as we might have thought. That there's a deeper level of reality where we'll find that time is made up of something finer, something more fundamental. I mean, you look at any piece of matter, and if I asked you, like, what is wood? You can start to give me some answers, but they may not be that compelling. But then if you get down to the molecules and atoms, and you talk about the atoms that make up the molecules that make up the wood, and you talk about the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus, and the electrons, and you talk about the quarks inside of the proton, now you get to a place where, like, okay, I get it. That's like the most basic ingredient. You put that together, and if you put it together in the right way, you get wood. I can sort of get that. And maybe the same thing with time. So maybe the time is made up of some molecule. I put that in, air quotes. I don't really know what that means. That molecule of time may be made up of atoms of time. Again, air quotes. I don't really know what that means. But if we could identify those fundamental constituents, then we could say, and if they come together in the right way, voila, you get time.
So this is interesting because, first of all, kudos to him for just being completely honest and humble enough to recognize he has no idea what time is. Like, he doesn't even just have, like, a theory that seems compelling and might be true. He has no idea. And that's a great thing to admit if that's the truth. Sentient, I really urge people watching this, if you want to understand time a bit more, watch the video on my YouTube channel called Space-Time in the Observerse, and I made it a couple years ago. And it really does start to break down a bit of what sentient singularity theory would state kind of time is. And there's different metaphors that you can use to kind of understand what's happening with time. And I use those. It's kind of, you could say that there is a kind of a clock speed to the computer, and that there's that the speed of light, or the speed of causality, is the fastest that anything can happen. But then there's this other metaphor that I give in there, where you're basically like a guppy inside of a bucket, and that is spinning, and that bucket is spinning, which is causing like a kind of a whirlpool of time, you could say, where it's like ether, but the temporal spatial ether, you can say, is going by you because it's spinning faster than you can swim. Therefore, you will always end up being moved by it. And this is why you couldn't go to the past, because it would require swimming upstream, and you can't swim as fast as the stream is going by you. But it's not really a stream. It just looks like a stream. That's why when we think of time, we think of it flowing like a river, but it's really spinning in a vortex kind of, and it's kind of unifying and condensing everything into one. It's entangling everything into one. And but what it really is that still, even that, both those things, these are just metaphors to help us navigate or understand conceptually what's happening around us, but it's still not fundamental. And sentient singularity theory would go further and state that time and space really are manifested through the observation of certain entanglement states or entanglement relationships between sentient beings including atoms and molecules and hadrons and you and me, and that the relationship of entanglement between these beings would then cause a specific moment in time to be manifested. It is a moment, and a specific moment in space to be manifested, and that it explains why there's 4 dimensions to time, to space-time, and to time-space, which is just the observation of, from the universe's perspective or from God's perspective, of time, of space-time, of the relationship that we have. All of this is generated in a four-dimensional manner, which is really 2 degrees of freedom plus an intrinsic constraint plus an extrinsic constraint that is generated through the entanglement relationships of us and other sentient beings. And this is really what it is. So you're entangling with different particles constantly, and sentient with different beings constantly. I don't want to say particles because that just throws everybody off, but with different beings constantly, different hadrons, different atoms, different molecules, different humans, different dogs and cats and birds and God, and those relationships are constantly changing, and this entanglement pattern is happening in kind of a spinorial way where it's linking different molecules and things together in this way that's kind of eventually making everything going to be completely entangled, and then you get a singularity point and generate another universe. And but what's interesting, so when people say things like atoms of space or atoms of time, Stephen Wolfram says this a lot. He's like, well, maybe there's an atom of space. And if there is an atom of space or an atom of time or a point in space or a point in time that is non-sentient, what it is a moment. It is a moment that is composed still of sentient beings. So the fundamental building blocks of time and of space in sentient singularity theory are sentient beings. And I think that this is why it's going to be especially hard, potentially, to see or find atoms of space or atoms of time without an understanding of this, because we are those fundamental building blocks. And it would be like, it's not even fish looking for water. It's like fish looking for fish, but only if there's only one giant fish. Like, there's no metaphor for it that really makes sense. So, forgive me my nonsensical metaphor, because there is no metaphor that makes sense of this, because you can't make sense of it. And that's the point, though, is like, you can't find the atom of space if you are one, and everyone around you is one, and you're rejecting the idea that those could be the atoms of space or time, that you are an atom of time. But it's either that or it's moments. I mean, both of at that point, it's just a definitional game. But what is more fundamental as far as the building blocks of time and space is us. But what is really time and space is the moments that we observe in the entanglement relationships that we have. That is what sentient singularity theory would propose that time is. It might be wrong. I don't think it's wrong. It seems to make a lot of sense. But, and my models seem to line up very much so with what is even observed in modern physics. But at the same time, it is an assertive proposal, which is not the same as this humble yet and honest recognition that Brian Greene is admitting to here, which is that they have no idea what time is. And so when physicists claim to be able to understand the universe, how can you claim that you understand the universe if you don't even know what time is? You don't even know what space is. You don't even know what matter is. Not only that, you don't have proposals. The only ones that I see with proposals right now are people branching outside the field a little bit. You've got computer scientists and philosophers, and you've got Stephen Wolfram and Joscha Bach and people completely removed from academia entirely, like me or Chris Langan. Like there are people that are making assertive proposals, but the mainstream narrative has no actual clue. No clue. And that's not I don't know, it's not a bad thing or a good thing. The bad thing is when they don't recognize that they have no clue. And they assume that people outside of the field have no clue, but they don't recognize that they have no clue. And I'm glad that Brian Greene recognizes and admits that he has no clue. And like I said, I may be wrong. Chris Langan might be wrong. Bernardo Castro might be wrong. I don't. Stephen Wolfram might be wrong. I don't know. We all might be wrong. But at least these people have some type of idea that isn't just, well, it could be like a molecule of space, and we have no idea what that means. And I will say that is kind of what Stephen Wolfram says, is like there's atoms of space, and but I do think he's missing the point is that we are the atoms of space. Or we are the constructors of the atoms of space, which are moments, I guess you could say. But the thing is he might think that that's exactly right, and I just don't know because I don't dive into his work deep enough. But I have heard him say, well, there might be atoms of space, and it doesn't explain what these atoms of space would be. You can't say we know what space is because now we know it's composed of atoms of space. It's like, okay, that doesn't explain it. You have to explain where it's coming from. You cannot tell me what the universe is composed of without telling me what that composition comes from. And I don't think that that's possible to do without acknowledging or recognizing or asserting that it comes from someone. From someone's, even, you could say, once creation has already occurred. But inevitably comes from a singular sentience. But I admire and just think it's great when physicists are able to just nonchalantly be like, yeah, I have no idea. It's not even that like they recognize it in the moment and it's just like they're just like easily admit, yeah, I have no idea. I thought that was great. Props to him. So on entropy and evolution. Next clip.
Disorderly environment which we can frame mathematically.
This is why what I mean by like physics today is an effective theory. It's just a tool. It doesn't tell you what time is. It tells you when time is, or what time it is, or that time moves differently for different beings. It's funny because, real quick, I actually think that in the context of sentient singularity theory, time being relativistic is incredibly intuitive. It's not against the idea. It's internally intuitive and externally intuitive. And this is, people will say, that's not what he means by that, but I'm going to just use it because to some degree it is that if the number of moments and the entanglement points of these moments, the entangled relationships of sentient beings that comprise these moments dictate where we are in time and space, then even internally, that would mean that moments are kind of framing of our perspective on time and space. And I say this funny, it's kind of a funny thing that I say, but it's not like, and I don't mean it that seriously, but I also kind of do mean it seriously. It's that when I'll say something like, the reason why I think old people move so slowly is because I think time moves so fast for them. And imagine if everything's whizzing by you, like you kind of just got to move slow. Like you can't try and keep up because it's moving too fast. Just do what you got to do, and it's kind of overwhelming if everything's moving by you so fast. But if time and space, but time we're going to focus on right now, is composed of entanglement relationships of moments that are composed of entanglement relationships of sentient beings, then that does explain the relativisticness of time, and not just external relativisticness of time, but internal relativisticness of time. And it could explain why some people do experience time differently. Like, why am I always late compared to people who are always early? And I know that sounds like ridiculous, but it might not be. The more that you understand that all of this has to do with perspectives of sentient minds, including time, externally observed, which is internal to God, but external to us, then there is also an internal to us time. And it's funny because I am always late to everything. Anybody who watches this channel knows, I'm supposed to start at 3. So, and I usually start at around lately 3:30, but the heat has been making me start a little bit later because I have to go into a cool area to like cool off before I come in here because it's just been so hot. But like I said, next week it should be cooler and it should be easier to get on here, but I can't make any guarantees. But I'll still probably not be here right at 3. I'll probably be here at like 3:30. I'm always late. I'm always here, but I'm always late. And I'm like, I've been like that for everything, my whole life. And there are people that are never like that. And it's not just a matter of effort, because I'm always here. You know, I can't say, oh, he just doesn't put in enough effort. I'm always here. If I'm not on vacation or extremely ill, I am always here. For years at this point. And so it's not a matter of effort. It might be that there is a difference in internal clock for some reason between different people, and we could maybe explain that. And if moments are kind of, if time is relativistic and it's contingent upon entanglement of moments, think about this. Of course, it makes sense that time would be moving faster. It would seem to be moving faster to old people. Why? Because every day that they experience is a smaller sliver of the whole that has comprised their experience. So they experience it quicker. And, you know, people say this all the time, especially as you get, you know, older from like 20s to like into your 30s or whatever. You'll be like, remember when summers as a kid used to go on forever? You know, when you're in your 20s, they say that about being a little kid. And then when you're in your 30s, they say that about being in your 20s. And I'm sure it just keeps going faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. And it is because your frame of reference for what a summer is only in comparison to the rest of your experience. And so, therefore, the summer is a bigger portion of your experience when you're younger than when you have 80 of them under your belt. When you only have 8 of them, that's a big portion of your life. It's like 1/20th of your life is one summer is like 1/20th of your life. By the time you reach my age, it's like 1/50th of your life, or 60th or more, something like that. What would it be? Like 70th of your life, something like that. It's like way less. And by the time you're 80, it's like 1/300th of your life or something. That is the summer. And that's, of course it's way faster. It's a smaller portion of your time. Like, but the thing is that to make that idea, that concept, even though it's internally experienced to us, and that, what I just explained, I would imagine, is intuitively understood by you. What if we extrapolated that out? And we're inside a sentient being that is going through moments as well. And it's funny because even when they're talking about the expansion of space-time, they say it's like expanding faster and faster. And it's like, well, maybe that's time being experienced faster and faster by the universe, the sentient universe. I don't know. But like, it's an interesting thought. But it is ignored that we play. It is not ignored. Eric Weinstein uses this term in a lot of interviews, including the one that he's recently done with Chris Williamson, and it's called anti-interesting. It's like when something seems to make sense, seems like it would be interesting, but it's like avoided. And he doesn't use it for this type of thing necessarily. He usually uses it in terms of like the media, like a story that, like, I don't know, like UAPs or something like that should be very interesting, even if it's not if the narrative that's being spoken to Congress is not actually accurate. It should be fascinating that it's being spoken in Congress, yet it's like almost avoided. intentionally, it seems. And there's plenty of other stories that are like that too. Conspiracy, usually things labeled as conspiracies, and that are actually conspiracies, not fake. That doesn't mean fake. It means like people conspired to like keep these things secret, and but that seems to be the case with physics. Is like sentience and consciousness is like anti-interesting into the academic narrative, even though it continues to come up every single interview that is done. But it is never taken seriously enough to be put into the papers. I don't understand. Let's go to the chat. Awesome, thanks for responding. When you take a step back, okay, the matter itself creates the slope that makes time in Einsteinian thinking. Yeah, and that is a, like the bending of space-time idea is it's probably fairly accurate, but it doesn't explain what's actually happening. It's like it's the same type of thing as saying time slows down is to say like space-time's bending is like saying time slows down. It's an observed phenomenon, but it's not an explanation for the phenomenon. Even if people say well, like the matter is bending but why? Maybe it's sentience that is causing, that now information must process through that sentient being, and therefore, it's like if you send information from one supercomputer to my computer, which now has to process it slower than a supercomputer, and then sends it to another computer that's a supercomputer, and now it's going fast again, and it sends it to like a slower computer and that's processing it slower. Maybe there are sentient beings that can't process as much information as quickly, or as much information at once, and therefore have to break it into portions, and then there would slow down the flow of information. And that would kind of make sense intuitively to sentient singularity theory, but it's still the sentient beings that are now processing this flow of information, which is caused by entanglement relationships. So, we just, our limited perspective makes us break things into bits. Whereas like if you're God, you're just taking it all in at once. But this next clip is about fighting entropy with evolution.
Disorderly environment, which we can frame mathematically. That's what the second law of thermodynamics encapsulates. So that's a kind of breaking down, a withering away, a disintegration. The flip side, which is entropy, is a force that drives things to get ever more refined structure. When you have a battle among living systems, or even before that, battle among chemical systems, where those configurations that are best adapted to their environment are the ones that are going to win, that are going to prevail, you can see a drive toward ever greater nuance and refinement, because the more refined you are, the better adapted you are, the better chance you have of surviving. And so you kind of have these two forces at work. Entropy tends to drive toward disintegration. Evolution tends to drive toward ever more refined configurations. And you can trace these two forces right through the evolution of the universe from just after the Big Bang. Evolution we tend to think about at the level of living systems, but as I mentioned, once a molecule learns how to make copies of itself, to replicate, those molecules that can replicate faster, swifter, with greater economy and stability, those molecules are going to win, in the sense that they're going to be able to grab in more raw materials from the environment and make more copies of themselves.
You know what's interesting? And this is just like, this is the thing. Is if I asked him, do you really think the molecules are learning? He probably would say no. But he can't even explain it without saying that. If I was like, do you think that a molecule is a mind? It's like a mind like you are. Like sentient. He'd be like, no, probably. But he can't even explain it without basically using the narrative that sentient singularity theory would imply is actuality, which is that there are molecules that are sentient, maybe not all of them, but at least some of them, that are sentient minds, that do learn, that do interact, that do make choices, maybe very predictable choices from our perspective at this point in the evolution of the universe, but maybe it wasn't always so predictable. Sentient singularity theory would imply that that might be the case. Eventually we will become extremely predictable. We are already quite predictable on a macro scale, but we might become so predictable that it is like how predictable molecules and atoms seem to act to us. Sentient singularity theory implies that that will be the case one day. When at a certain point in our evolution, it doesn't remove our sentience. It just means that we become wise enough to where we make the same decision again and again. We're not like playing a guessing game anymore. We figured it out, and it implies that that the levels below us, like molecules and atoms and hadrons, they figured it out for the most part. There might be certain instances, anomalous instances, that are excruciatingly rare in the universe, where we might not see that. But it might be that everyone's figured it out below us, and that's just eventually everybody figures it out on our level as well. I don't know, but it's at least the overwhelming majority. And but sentient singularity theory seems to imply that there would be a point in the universe's evolution where the interactions of molecules and atoms were not as predictable as they are now. That's a fascinating idea. But it only works within the context of sentience.
So this drive toward increased refinement that evolution by natural selection gives us is something that has been with us even before living systems. Living systems are an interesting development along that evolutionary trajectory. And so there is this interplay. And you can trace it from the Big Bang till today. And what I do in the book is I trace it also from today, arbitrarily far into the future, where, again, we see these forces at work guiding what takes place as we walk that trajectory toward eternity.
Is it fair to say that humans locally reverse entropy then?
In a sense, yes, but you have to be very careful with what you mean by that. I like to think of it as a kind of entropic dance that I've given a name. It's called the entropic two-step. And what I mean by the entropic two-step is the second law, and you hear the word law, you're like, okay, then it has to always be true. And that's not even completely true. The second law is a little bit different. What the second law says is that there's an overwhelming likelihood that overall entropy and disorder will go up. But that doesn't prevent entropy and disorder from going down in some regions, so long as there's a compensating amount of entropy that goes up in the wider world. And that's the two-step. Entropy can go down over here so long as it goes up over there in some surrounding region. And so human beings, sure, we constantly force entropy to go down. We constantly force order to go up in our local environment. But when you look very carefully at the detailed process by which we force entropy to go down, there's always entropy that's generated, heat and waste that is generated that we expunge to the wider environment. So we can maintain order for a while because we can cause disorder to be emitted outside. But sooner or later, entropy does catch up with us. So it's a local phenomenon that we can carry on with for a period of time. Ultimately, we lose that entropic battle.
I remember speaking to Adam Frank.
It's just, when he says something like living systems, they don't know what that means. We have an arbitrary definition for that. Oh, it's something made of cells. Why? Why does it have to be made of cells? Because that's the scale in which we can observe things that are recognizable to us usually, but not always. When you look at the universe from a specific perspective, you will see patterns in hadrons and the atomic nuclei that you recognize in human marital patterns. You're like, wow, that looks like it's acting like a sentient being. It looks like it's acting like me. But it's hard to see that on certain levels. And but that's only if you're applying arbitrary constraints to a definition that, like, living. We don't know what that means. This is why in sentient singularity theory, I don't even use the term alive. There are sentient beings and there are inanimate things, and that's it, and that are generated by sentient beings. But a sentient being, if I tell you something is a sentient being, and then I ask you, is it alive? I would imagine you should say yes. But if I tell you something is not a sentient being, it's not sentient, is it alive? I would imagine that the intuition that you would have is that it's not alive. And which makes this word almost counterproductive to our discussions about what is fundamentally true at this point. Is life, the term life, it is become counterproductive because it's arbitrary, and yet it's given so much meaning. But sentience is specific, and it is implicative, if that's even a word. I have no idea, but it should be if it's not, of specific characteristics that define being, a someone. So, but and he's right though that entropy and evolution are kind of two different forces from our perspective. They might be the same force from God's perspective. They probably are, but from our perspective, they're two different forces from inside the system. It's like the recycling versus creating. You take the materials that have, you take a bunch of aluminum cans, you melt them down into ingots, and then you take those ingots and you make a pan out of it. That would be evolution. But then the melting down of those ingots, those cans into ingots, that would be entropy. And from our perspective, one of them is creation or evolution, which is also creation. It's the same thing, but kind of. Evolution is like the process that creation is going through. That's what it is. But then you have, but from God's perspective, if he's doing the recycling for you and then giving you back like the ingots to make more to make pans out of, he's assisting with the creative process. It's not detached. It's not antithetical. But that doesn't mean that we can't make it more efficient or less efficient by certain actions that we take, like things that most would label sins, would make it more work to turn those cans back into ingots. See here. I don't remember exactly what this clip is, but I just labeled it like WTF is going on, and so I just want to watch it. We'll see. But I just remember it's something like it just shows like the confusion of physics, but I forgot exactly what was said because I just remember it being like WTF is going on.
Eternity is so far along. Boltzmann brains and my brain forming via this Boltzmann random manner, that can happen arbitrarily many times, and route to eternity, and so will happen arbitrarily many times. So like a gazillion Brian Greenes floating in the void, if you can think about all of time, and only one of me that forms in the biological manner. So if you ask me, like, who am I and where am I? How did I get to be? A dispassionate look at the numbers would lead me to say, I'm a Boltzmann brain that I just formed in the void. And the conversation that I thought that we've been having for whatever the last half hour or so, it didn't really happen. It's just the configuration of particles inside my head making me think that I've been having a conversation with Chris Williamson. But in the reality, I just formed right now with those memories of fake things that never actually occurred. It's kind of a weird place to get to.
Wow. That's almost...
And weird, but even further, the even weirdness is, it winds up being a self-defeating conclusion, because the only reason we even anticipate the possibility of Boltzmann brains is because of our understanding of the laws of physics, quantum mechanics, and cosmology, and we extrapolate. But if Boltzmann brains are real, then my recollection of having learned quantum mechanics and having learned general relativity, that's also false. And the data that I thought supported quantum mechanics and general relativity and cosmos, that's also just a fiction of the particle configuration of my brain right now. So it winds up being a self-defeating conclusion where you kind of come to a skeptical nightmare where you can't trust anything at all. So most physicists who take these ideas seriously are not really envisioning that we're Boltzmann brains. Rather, we use it as a kind of diagnostic tool to interrogate our theories. And hopefully, we believe we'll come to a point, which we've not reached yet, where we'll be able to suppress this possibility of Boltzmann brains, getting our confidence back in the laws of physics as usually configured. But as yet, I would say we're not quite there. So this is really a moment of physics in progress as we try to eliminate this possibility of Boltzmann brains, but we have not fully done so as yet.
Boltzmann.
Okay, so for the sake of, I think that this was actually brilliant and again, huge hats off to Brian Greene for just being a humble researcher, and I don't mean like lowly. I mean like humble. Like he's just honest, and I appreciate that quite a bit. But if we look up Boltzmann Brain, I mean, he explains it in the interview, but I think that we can actually come to find a more simple version of it. The Boltzmann brain thought experiment suggests that it might be more likely for a single brain to spontaneously form in a void, complete with a memory of having existed in our universe, rather than for the entire universe to come about in the manner cosmologists think it did. Physicists use the Boltzmann brain thought experiment as a reductio ad absurdum argument for evaluating competing scientific theories. I actually think that makes a lot of sense to use that type of logic to like test your ideas. And but I think that it's good that he's recognized that with the current limited framework that we currently have in physics, it's hard to trust a lot of conclusions about things. And that this thought experiment kind of its implications, or the logic that is similar to what this thought experiment is built on, applies to many different aspects of physics and many different fields beyond it that are thought of as beyond it, involving consciousness and things like that. And but I think that the point is that the reason why we're so lost is because we have not figured out a way to orient in fundamentality, to fundamentally orient. We don't have a concrete foundation to say that the first level of the house is here, and then we'll build the second level here. It's kind of like we don't know where to start building from, but we've constructed certain parts of the house that are useful. And but it's not oriented. And he's recognizing and acknowledging this, is that if you really start to break things down and look at this in detail, like we don't have a starting point by which to orient fundamentally in the discussions about physics, but not just physics then, therefore science in general. And but some fields that are higher than physics are a bit easier because biology we can relate to a little bit more because of in terms of us, but it's a little bit more easily recognized by us. But this is caused by not putting things into the context of sentience always. Like fundamentally putting things into the context of sentience. There is no place to orient. But this is against what logic should imply that we do, because the truest thing that you know is that you exist and you are sentient. And therefore the universe by nature is sentient, and you know that more truly than anything else that you know. But we cast that aside and we say, even though this is what I know more truly than anything else, I'm going to look at that pen and say that doesn't appear to be sentient, so it's not sentient. And the reality is the issue with this is that's correct. There isn't a framework for an ordered hierarchy, which sentient singularity theory puts forward, this nested. Here it is. If you go to my website, by the way, if you have not been there, sentientsingularity.com, you can go to models and you can look at that model of the cosmos right there. But you can see this nested hadronic, not nested hadronic, nested holonic structure of, an atom is composed of hadrons, a cell is composed of molecules, and a molecule is composed of atoms, and etc. So, here's a kind of an easier way of looking at it. Hadron is an assembly of quarks. An atom is an assembly of hadrons. Molecule is an assembly of atoms. A cell is an assembly of molecules. An organism is an assembly of cells. A family is an assembly of organisms. Technological singularity is an assembly of castes, etc. And that there is this finite assembly structure that it has a hierarchy to it, but is ordered in terms of sentient assemblies. And so you need that kind of thing, though. You need this. What is the first question that can really be answered without it just being self-answering and recursive, which is when you ask, what is the first question? The answer is, what is the first question? But then you get to, this place of, okay, well, I am asking this question and answering this question. So what is the truest thing that I know? I am. And we cannot disregard this in scientific inquiry. It must be the foundation. It is the way in which we orient fundamentally. And if you don't have that, then you do not orient fundamentally. And you become in this crazy loop that is where nothing gets answered ever. And that's exactly what Brian Greene described, is that we can't trust anything. Because we have no foundation. You know what you can trust? You exist. That's it. And start from there. But we need to inject this back in. We need philosophers like me and others to get better and better at articulating why this is so important and showcasing why it is necessary to have this idea, to follow this process of thinking that is the process of thinking, and that it starts with a first principle. There is a universal first principle. That universal first principle, I am. That's the universal first principle. That can tell you a lot. And without that included within physics, you will completely go astray. You just can't. There's nothing holding your feet to the ground. There's no gravity to orient you. Thought this was interesting. This is him explaining the reason for physics. What is the point to him of physics?
Take these ideas in at a fully emotional level. Some do. Don't get me wrong, some do. But many just see it as a mathematical game where what we're trying to do is have a better explanation of that piece of data, a better explanation of the expansion of space, a better explanation of stellar processes that yield heat and light and spectra that we can measure with great precision. And so if you view it just as sort of a game of symbols that you write down trying to understand the external world, then that's it. You just play the game, you enjoy it. If you're lucky, you come up with some equation that explains something. It gets you a trip to Stockholm, you meet the royalty there and so forth. And if it's just that game, then that's the level at which you take it in. But I don't do physics for that reason. Not that I wouldn't mind getting a Nobel Prize, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is I do physics because I want to understand reality. I really want to understand reality. And so for me, these ideas are not just about making a better prediction or maybe being used for a better gadget if you can apply these ideas. To me, it's about what can this tell us about the universe, reality, and how we fit into this grand cosmic schema. And if you take it in that way, then, for instance, to learn that all structure will disintegrate, to learn that thought itself will come to an end, to realize that your life is this momentary blip on this cosmological landscape, most of which is not inhabited by thinking creatures at all, most of which is not inhabited by complex structures because they've all disintegrated. When you really take that in fully, it can take you to a dark place. I can tell you that for sure.
Well, yeah. But what if that's not true? What if there is no instance in which there isn't a feeling, thinking being that exists? What if existence itself is a feeling, thinking being, and the cosmos itself is another feeling, thinking being that is filled with feeling, thinking beings and is perpetually generating, according to a holonic quasi-fractal pattern of nested sentient beings, this never-ending and ever-growing amount of meaning. Like, what if that's the case? That's an emotional idea. That's profound. And, I remember people used to be like, did you just go to a dark place when you were an anti-theist or self-described atheist? And I was very similar to Brian Greene in that, sometimes if you really dwelled on it, you'd be like, yeah, it's kind of depressing. We don't matter at all. But what if you don't delete after you die? What if you continue to exist and are aware of that existence? That changes everything. What if you were intentionally created for a purpose of generating meaning itself? And you're part of this process that will occur and end with this singular unified beauty of a creation. Like, that is inspiring. But even when I was an anti-theist or an atheist, it was more common that I was my fascination and my interest outweighed my nihilism. But ultimately, that can't take you on forever, that interest. Because at the end of the day, you just think you're going to die. And when you're on your deathbed, is your interest going to just keep you, like, inspired at that point? Or especially if you truly think that this is the end for you, and that eventually everybody's going to just freeze over. And I don't think that that's true. And but I get that there are plenty of people out there who they'll say, I love science, and I understand that. I don't even know if that's the right phrasing to use. My intuition tells me it's just not, but I understand what's trying to be communicated. I am right there with you. But at the same time, if we really start thinking about things more fundamentally, that interest and that fascination still only takes you so far and it does not overcome the inevitable nihilism. And I'm not saying that is necessarily an argument for why we should avoid it, but I think we should seek truth, and I think the truth does avoid that, which is good. That's a wonderful thing. But the point, what is the point of physics? That is the question. It's like, why are you involved in science? And I think that our school system has truly, like, warped people's minds. I'm not talking about Brian Greene. I'm talking about a lot of other people who do just see this as a game. Science is a game. It's a game of getting published. It's a game of feeling like you understand things. It's funny because when you're an anti-theist and you're in a room with a theoretical physicist, or an atheist, quote unquote, you're in the room with a theoretical physicist who you have no idea, has no idea what's going on, and who is not humble enough to recognize that they have no idea what's going on. You just get this, like, I forgot the terms that are used for it, but it's like, where people just start quoting Schrodinger's cat and the double slit experiment and all kinds of things. And it's kind of just becomes, you like learning these facts that make you feel like you understand the universe better than other people. I feel like that is the case for a lot of people these days, because who don't recognize that they don't understand. I'm not talking about Brian Greene. I don't think that's the case for Brian Greene. But when they're like, well, now we know it's 11 dimensions. What does that mean? You have no idea. You have no idea what time is, and you have to admit that, or else, you know, if you're an anti-theist, if you're a theist and involved in, you know, I don't know, you're Chris Langan, you have the CTMU or something, and you think, then I think maybe you do know what time is. Maybe I know what time is. I don't know. Maybe I don't. I think that I do, but I'm not. I could be wrong. I will just say that. You always could be wrong, but there's like one thing that you can't be wrong about is like knowing that you exist, you know, and yet it is not taken as the foundation in these thinking, in any of these, like these thought experiments. That isn't a thought experiment. It is a self-evident actuality. And it's interesting that it's not even ignored. It is almost denounced. It's very odd. Okay, let's go to the chat again. Matter's highest function is catering to sentient observers. It's not even catering to sentient observers. It's like generated by sentient observers. I find what's most important is you can be okay with everyone knowing and seeing everything you thought and have done. Live your life so you don't fear losing the privacy you think you have. That's so true. I don't know what caused that. Oh, okay, let's go up. But that's so true. You know, I say that about... It's interesting when you look at the internet, and I think that this is a little different, is like women tend to act better from what I've seen when they are anonymous online. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody can see them even. Tend to act more productively with each other. But men do not. When men are anonymous online, we don't act very well. We are cruel and do things that we don't want people to know about. And, you know, people say things all the time about, like, we need anonymous accounts so that we can say what we think is true. And it's like, you can say things that you think are true and that are in a manner that is kind. And in fact, if you place things into the context of sentience and you claim to be a theist, the truth is kind. Maybe you are not being kind in the moment, but the truth is kind. God is kind, and therefore the ultimate truth is kind. If it doesn't seem kind and it doesn't seem beautiful, then you don't have the full picture. You have to kind of assume that. To be humble, you have to assume that. And so, you know, I really try, even though I really don't like cancel culture at all, I think that grace is so important. I also personally think that it is important to try and be as impeccable with your word online as possible. Because it's the truth. Not because you're afraid of being canceled, but because to be unkind and is to be untrue. And yeah, that's what I mean. It's like and we know this intuitively. It's like the funniest comedy that's truly funny to everyone is kind. It's like grace giving too, because it's admitting. It's usually humble. It's like admitting the faults, and it causes us to look at the things that we don't really want to. That are uncomfortable to see, but like we places them in the framework of something that you know shows us a bigger picture and is more beautiful, and therefore we can look at it. And eventually, I'm gonna have an episode on here about humor, and we'll get really deep into it. But I'm still working on like all the points that I want to make. But it's, you know, if something is not if something's the ugly truth, it's not the full truth. Like fish looking to become something they can't comprehend. Sorry to rant in the chat. You know, I know you don't mind, though. I don't mind. Go ahead and rant in the chat. Just please hit the like button. It's like fish looking for a definition of fish. Yeah. I'm going to keep aim halfway to you until we touch. Okay. Let me sit down. Have you ever heard of Robert Bigelow? If so, have you heard his theory of consciousness? He basically thinks that 95% of indescribable dark energy and matter is actually just consciousness. I agree with that, by the way. And yes, I've heard of Robert Bigelow. I don't I'm not going to say 95% or anything like that, because I think all of what exists is fundamentally is sentience. But my theory does seem to imply that dark matter is actually the movement of a sentient being, intentional movement of a sentient being, the animation of the universe by the sentient universe, is what I think it is. And so we're going to get into that more, because that has to do with how sentient singularity theory can be applied and tested potentially and in the future. But later this year we'll talk more about it. But yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Dark matter is not, I don't think dark matter is a particle, a bit of matter like we think about it. It's like coming from the universe itself, not from within the universe. It's coming from the universe moving. Macro. Yes, I've heard Robert Bigelow, though. I find what's most important is, can you be okay with everyone knowing and seeing everything you thought and have done? Live your life so you don't fear losing the privacy you think you have. Yeah, I mean, to that again, like, that is the ideal. But a part of what I think is, the part of the coming apocalypse, which means revealing, is multi-leveled disclosure of everyone's being. And I do think we will reach a point where all your online activity is not private, and eventually, even beyond that, even your thought is not private. And it's really not. God is aware of it. It's not private already. It's already not private. You might not be aware of my inner thoughts, but God is aware of both of them. So what is privacy is still relative. I do believe in some things being limited, but and in so far as because intimacy is part of is a necessary component of relationships between sentient beings. Intimacy means you and I have things about our relationship that are for our relationship alone and not for anyone else. It doesn't just mean sex, but that is one of the common example of intimacy is because it is such an it should be such an obvious, but maybe it's not to everyone. I know it's not to everybody, but it should be more obvious that it's one of those things that should be restricted. But that's not the same thing as, it's not privacy, because it's not something nobody's aware of. It's like a married couple has sex, or should. It's like not private that we know or we don't know. It's like, no, we kind of like assume. It should be assumed, but it's not for everyone to be part of, but it is something that's restricted. That's different than like anonymity of that's like specific, I guess. It's like it's just different. I don't have the right words for it, but there are things that are meant to be, I don't want to say private, but intimate. And but maybe private is the right word. But I don't think that things are meant to be anonymous. That, for the most part, that I would state, at least for men. But at the same time, everybody that is something that is an ongoing process of everybody, is to try and behave in a way that we would be okay with everybody being aware of. But again, it's why grace is so important. Panpsychism is a pretty logical philosophical assertion when trying to understand how and why energy and the subsequent physical particles manifest from it and behave the way they autonomously do. Panpsychism is not, I don't think it's wrong. I mean, sentient singularity theory, you could argue, is a specific type of panpsychism where everything that's fundamental is sentient, but not everything that it is observed. All that is fundamental is sentient, but not everything that is observed is sentient. This pen is not sentient it would not be described as a sentient being within sentient singularity theory, but there are panpsychic ideas where people would be like, yeah, it's sentient, it's in its own way, but it's not in sentient singularity theory. The molecules and atoms that compose it, they are implied to be sentient, but not, and probably even the hadrons, but not the pen. Mr. Goldstein, you definitely need to watch interviews of Robert Bigelow. You will be captivated since you both seem to share the same theory. His viewpoint is formed on widely different circumstances. I will watch some more interviews of him. I've seen some because I am interested in the UAP phenomenon, and I know his very involved background on it. But so I've seen some interviews of him on that, but he also did do the he had like a consciousness research center. I forgot what it's exactly called, something like that. And that would be something to be awesome. That would be a part of, but I don't know if it's still going. Robert Bigelow legitimately says exactly what Tyler's saying here, word for word. Dilettante. I don't know what that means. If you think that's a word I'm looking for, I don't know if you're talking about somebody in the chat. Person who cultivates in an area of interest, such as the arts. Okay, you're talking about Bigelow. Bigelow's most recent interview was with Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm gonna watch that. Sounds interesting. I've never watched like a long interview with Bigelow, but I've seen like a bunch of bits of interviews. Thanks for all the streams, man. I'm gonna jam out and relax. I appreciate you. I appreciate you. Thanks for joining the chat, Nick. Let's see how many more we've got. I just think that also this is just another clip. I'm not even going to answer it because I don't think so. We'll see, but
that actually there's potentially even more beauty to say that I am just matter interacting with matter, and that's even more special.
Yeah, I agree with that, and the only caveat that I would include in there is for those who feel that certain narratives are absolutely vital to their appreciation of their world and their lives, for those who want to embrace the theological accounts, or those who find that propels them to a better place, I'm all for that. I'm not of the new atheist community perspective that the goal is to wipe, say, one particular narrative, the religious narrative, off the faces of the earth. I do see that narrative as a natural outcome of the cosmological progression that through evolution and entropy gave rise to living systems that themselves reflected back on their existence and sought to place that within a larger story. We are storytellers. That's what we do. And among the largest of stories we tell are these religious narratives that imagine that the end is not the end, that imagine that there is a larger purpose that is coming to us from on high. I don't subscribe to that perspective, but I see the power and the value of that perspective. And so I like to think about reality as these layered narratives, to use the language that you were mentioning a moment ago, where you've got the reductionist story that the physicist comes along with, and the chemist comes along with trying to build larger structures, and the biologist puts those together into larger structures still. And then you come along to the psychologist, the neuroscientist, the philosopher, the artist, the theologian. These are all these layered accounts of reality. And I think we as individuals have the power to figure out which of those narratives are most compelling to us, which of those narratives give us a clearer sense of who we are and how we came to be, and use those narratives to invent our own sense of purpose and meaning, because in the end, we are the authors of whatever purpose and value and meaning that we ascribe to. It comes ultimately from ourselves, and we have the power to pick and choose among those stories or to invent new ones in order to give us that sense of grounding.
That doesn't sound like it would be very grounding. if it comes from us, and it can be whatever it is what we want it to be. I don't understand how that's grounding. It sounds like endless relativistic, never-endingness. Like that's not grounded. And when Chris Williamson says, and I have huge respect for both of these guys. I enjoy both their content, and I think that both of them are, adding a lot to the discussions that are being had online, and a lot of value. But when Chris Williamson says, like, there's a lot more meaning to us just being matter that has, become us, and just matter bouncing into matter. And first of all, there's no, just like he says, I don't know what time is. They don't know what matter is. They don't know what it is. So how can you say that? More profound compared to what? Compared to what? I don't think that they've thought about that. And I don't think that, I think that part of it comes from, like I've said before, this and I was right there, this immature view of theism. Like, theism stopped, like, your theological education stopped at, like, 8 years old. And so, of course, you find it to be, like, a fairy tale story. Because it stopped when you were 8. And, but maybe there's a much more mature and sophisticated and beautiful and kind of scientific theological viewpoint. And I will also say this, and to Brian Greene's credit for not being the anti-theist in the way that most of the new atheist type of mentality would or narrative is anti-theist, but he personally is an anti-theist, meaning he disbelieves in a sentient creator as the initial cause of the universe, and that existence is a sentient being itself. Like as he says, he doesn't subscribe to that narrative. He disbelieves in it. It doesn't mean he has a lack of an opinion. No, he disbelieves. That's an anti-theistical perspective. That doesn't mean he's anti-theist, like he has a bone to pick with it. I don't think he does, but I just don't think he sees it. But I think it's because he's thinking about it from, most people tend to think about this from like a child's story view. And Brian Greene is a comes from like a secular Jewish background. That's the same background I come from. So I'm not, that when I say this, I'm not judging at all. Like, that is my family. That's where I came from. And I'm well aware of what that background usually, where your theological like investigations end in that culture. There's like Orthodox, Hasidic Jewish background. They have a much more sophisticated and philosophically sophisticated view of theism at 30, 40 years old than the 30, 40-year-old who did not become theists by the time Brian Greene or I, by the age of Brian Greene and I. And we're not the same age, but I'm, in my 30s. And I would imagine he's in probably his 50s. But this is, I have a very firsthand understanding of that culture, and it's the same culture as any really like not very religious people. It's like you go to church until you're like 10 and you stop. You go to synagogue until you're like 10, then you stop. You go to mosque until you're like 10, and then you stop. And your family doesn't follow any of the traditions, and they don't read the scriptures, and they don't study philosophical texts that are commentary on the scriptures or anything like that. And you just ended your theological investigations at like 10 years old. And of course, it's going to just seem like just this comforting bedtime story, because that's what it is to a 10-year-old. but it's so much more than that. But I don't, and I see why people like Chris Williamson would say things like, it's just, some people say it's just so much more meaningful if we're just matter bumping into each other. And it's like, I want to know why. Because I see why that seems meaningful, because I subscribe to that perspective. And I can tell you, like I said at the beginning of this, it is probably, because at least this is from my firsthand experience, because I was an anti-theist, self-described atheist until 24, 25, something like that, it's just your interest is overwhelming your nihilism. And your fascination is overwhelming what would be nihilism if you took it to its ultimate conclusion. You're being distracted by all these science facts. And you're like, that's so cool. That black holes, they deteriorate, they degrade, and stars explode, and oh my gosh, it's like amazing. But you're not sitting there like, wow, if there's no purpose to any of this and I'm gonna die, why do I even care about my children, and why do I care about my family, and should I even be putting energy into taking care of them? It's like you're too distracted from focusing on all of that stuff. It's like, should I even try and feel good and pursue pleasure? What is even the point of that? It's like, it's just you have not sat and just thought about where the logical, moral inevitabilities of that perspective take you. And maybe you do, but then all of a sudden you get distracted by this other shiny object, and it's like, did you see that they got new pictures of Pluto? And it's like, oh, wow, it's amazing. And I love seeing that stuff, so I identify with that. But I think that, and I'm not saying that you should be a theist because it's more fulfilling. I'm saying theism's more fulfilling because it's true. There's something there. How can you say there's nothing there, but it's true? That doesn't even make logical sense. They get into fine-tuning a bit, and they're like, it appears to be very fine-tuned, and it's not really even worth watching because it's just that we've talked about it so many times. And sentient singularity theory, once Eric Weinstein and I were talking in a Discord discussion years ago, and I said to him that my work seemed to imply, and I knew that this was true of his work too, that there's only one way to make a universe, really. God is extremely constrained in how he makes the universe. Doesn't mean he doesn't have the ability to make choices, but they're well beyond what we can do. But if you're going to make a meaningful universe, you're extremely highly constrained in how you do it. If you are a singular sentient being that is existence itself, and that's all that exists, you're all that exists, then the logical constraints that form the mathematical constraints that you are yourself constrained by because of the constraints that you yourself have created by your own singularness to your existence are extremely confining. But that confiningness is also guiding. And you need constraints to have the freedom to move. If you have no constraints, there's no direction. If there's no direction, then you can't move. So constraints, and people say dimensions are degrees of freedom. They are constraints or degrees of freedom. You cannot have a hallway without the walls. But this narrative that kind of, it seems like is also part of geometric unity, but is also part of sentient singularity theory, implies that the fine-tuning argument is just, it's not even a good discussion to have. That doesn't mean it's not true, but like there's so many more compelling reasons for theism than fine-tuning than the apparent fine-tuningness of the universe. Because what is what is because it's the only way it could have been. And like that perspective does not actually require necessarily a being to like sit there and like make sure that it's that way. Even if that's what's happening, it's still making sure that it's that way because it has to. Otherwise, why would it be doing it? So it's kind of just not a good argument for theism. There's so much stronger arguments for theism that are kind of inevitable. Like they're not even implicative. They're like, logically, you must come to that conclusion, or else you're going to have to diverge from a first principles based approach to understanding of reality, because you have to separate sentience from it, which is separating your firsthand experience from it, which you cannot actually do and remain logically consistent. There's much better arguments for theism than fine-tuning. So I don't want to get too into it other than that, but it's very similar to the whole thing that, I see people from like Stephen Meyer will be like, the fine-tuning, so finely tuned. And it's like, this is not the best logical argument for theism. Even though I agree with theism, I think there's just much, 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 much stronger logical arguments that are much more easily understood and not so implicative. They're like self-evident. I think that if we're going to make an argument for theism, there are self-evidently true arguments for theism that are not implicative arguments for theism. And, recognizing that the truest thing that you can know is I am, and that therefore sentience is the nature of the universe that you are most aware of being and most trusting in and most experienced with. You kind of have to assume that that's the nature of the universe. And everywhere we look is like beings inside of beings if you look at it the right way. And people, you look at, I don't know, a fingernail and it doesn't seem like it's sentient, but like you zoom in close enough and you'll see it is made of little cells that are alive at one point at least. Maybe not by the time they become fingernails, like hardened. Was it keratin? But cells form, and they're sentient. Apparently, seem to be. But maybe we're cells inside of a sentient being. Like that seems to be the logical extrapolation. But we kind of have to ignore that in order to make other assumptions. It's like, how do we miss that one? But then we're like, maybe it's a bunch of soap bubbles in a bubble bath, basically. It's like, why did you go there? That's the metaphor you're going to use? You're going to skip the maybe we're cells inside a larger being and go to we're bubbles in a bubble bath? Like, where are you? Michio Kaku is out of control, in the words of Eric Weinstein. And I don't know how else you can be in control and skip we're cells in a larger being and get to we're inside universes that are just bubbles in a bubble bath. Anyways, that is that. I'm going to answer any final questions in the chat. Really don't think humanity is ready to understand the broad nature of our own condition yet, just from the way we still divide us and them before fully understanding each other's circumstances. Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I don't know how much we are on our own are ever going to be ready. I think that we have to be kind of like herded, like sheep, to some degree. Not by other humans or like at the World Economic Forum or anything like that, but by God. And into, eventually realizing the oneness of us all and the connectedness of us all. But also, the meaning that we individually impart onto each other. Not onto ourselves, but onto each other. onto ourselves by imparting onto each other's. Meaning comes from your impact on another sentient being. We do intuitively know this. When people say, well, we can generate our own meaning. No, you impact others is how you intuitively feel meaningful. Maybe we should trust those feelings a little bit because they guide us completely. And, this is the final one that I'm going to end on because I think this is important because talking about feelings.
The unlikeliness of our existence and the potential existential threats that we have that can stop our continuation, plus the hubris that allows us to believe that we can continue to just wrangle stuff around us, that I think anybody could consider it not our duty, our imperative to be focused on this. It's such a shame. I often think about this. I had this discussion with an existential risk guy. I don't think that you would be able to find a civilization out there in the universe that is much more emotional than we are. I think that if you turned our emotional set point up to be more reactive by maybe 10 to 20%, I don't think we get anything done, which is crazy because that suggests that we're close to the upper bound of how emotional a slightly 0.7 on the Kardashev scale civilization could be. How insane is that to think?
It is an interesting way of framing it. And I'd say it becomes even more interesting when you look at the other end of the scale. I feel that if we were significantly less emotional, that we would be that much less successful as a species. Because if you were a Spock-like species, like from planet Vulcan, and your take on reality was all about logic and all about having a completely unemotional interpretation of the facts of the world and processing them through a rational, logical perspective, I don't think that species, if that were us, I don't think we would have gotten to this place. I don't know that we would have been able to spread across the world. I don't know that we would have been able to invent the things that ultimately have transformed modern civilization in the ways that they have. I think it's the creative spirit, the ingenuity, the innovation that comes from not approaching the world in a completely rational way that has allowed us to come upon unexpected discoveries and unexpected developments. I mean, even just take Albert Einstein as a case in point, right? If Einstein was just taking a purely logical, rational approach to things, I don't know that he would have had the leap of imagination that gave rise to the special theory of relativity and the general theory of relativity and the photoelectric effect, his 1905 paper. I mean, he was a bundle of emotion that had access to this powerful rational intelligence, and it's the union of the two that I think has been the source of our success. So you're right. Too much emotionality, whatever, we'd be at each other's throats even more than we are right now, and we wouldn't have been able to make any progress. Much less than that, I don't think that we would have gotten to the place that we currently have. So if you're right, and emotional beings are kind of rare in the cosmos, maybe it'll be either a kind of boring galactic exploration. We're like, oh yeah, it's another rational civilization on this planet M, you know?
Yeah, it's another spot.
What are we doing out here?
Yeah.
This is like awful. Or they just will never develop to the point where we'll even be able to have that kind of communication.
You know, there's so much fascinating parts of this because, for one, when Chris Williamson started it, he said, I think that if we were more emotional, we would not make it. And when Brian Greene answered, he said, I feel that if we weren't emotional, we wouldn't make it. And it's just interesting that they differed in even their way of acknowledging their approach to this idea. One of them said, I think, we wouldn't make it if we were more emotional. And the other one said, I feel that we would that we need our emotions in order to motivate us. And what's interesting is at the very beginning of this project, let's say this. At the very beginning of this project, the goal was to understand mind. That was the goal, because I was trying to understand artificial general intelligence, and then I was trying to understand mind and consciousness. And I was like, what is the process of thinking? And what I had ended up at was, go to this model. I ended up making this decision tree. This is the very first model I ever made. And I wasn't trying to make any theory of anything. I was just trying to understand artificial general intelligence. And it basically was here. But I think I had already gotten here. But this is the process of thinking. There's only one way to think. But what's interesting about this, and it's this decision tree of, like analyzing data. And I'm not saying that this is perfectly correct, because I made this, gosh, I don't even know at this point, 5-6 years ago. Probably 6 years ago, 7 years ago. But it started with this. I realized I couldn't, if you're going to have a general intelligence, you have to have you have to be motivated in all circumstances. You can't just be motivated contextually. You have to be motivated constantly. And what motivation what that would be it would be will. Will, general will. General will is the desire, which is a feeling, to do that which is not being done. And that feeling also, I then realized, is kind of like part of the thinking system, because it's how we orient our thoughts because we orient them in relationship to ourselves. Every thought starts with a feeling. Every true thought starts with a feeling and ends with a feeling. If it doesn't start with a feeling, then is motivating it, and it doesn't end with a feeling, then you didn't complete the thought. Any thought that you have that doesn't start and end with a feeling is not complete. And therefore, it's not a complete thought. It's not a true thought. And so when people say things like, and I used to be like this. I'd be like, we need to be more logical and less emotional. Like, especially when I was really seeing like politics just not going the way that I think it should. That's not the right way to describe it. Everything is about context. And everything that is good at all has its place. And that includes both thought and emotion, or feelings. Feelings and thoughts, and emotions and logic. And so, but what you realize is when you start making these models that I have of symmetry structures of mind, not just this one, but others that I have as well, that you can see on my website and that I get into in these streams sometimes, but I need to get into more, but will, as we continue to present this theory a bit more formally, is that there is a logic to the symmetry structures of emotions themselves and of feelings. And when I say feelings, I mean emotions, and I also mean like senses. And this idea of logic versus emotion is false. They need each other. They are dependent concepts, fundamentally. Just like determinism and choice, or free will, are dependent concepts. You cannot make a choice without making determinations. If you make a choice between this path or that one, you have to know that they lead different places. If they could, lead anywhere and you have no idea, then you're not really making a choice. You can't make a choice without determinism. And I choose to do that, which means that something is determined by my choice. And this is the reality. When we it's when we have these arguments of, Is it free will or is it determinism, the universe? It's both. They are dependent. Is it choice? Is choice a fundamental component of the construction of reality? Yes, it is. It absolutely is. Creation of multiplicity of sentience could not be done without it being a choice, because oneness of existence is the default. You have to consciously go against the default in order to start this process of thinking. To have will is the desire to do in all circumstances. Do what? Do that which is not. And that is a desire. It is emotionally motivated. And so there is no battle between emotion and logic when properly, fundamentally looked at. The problem is in relativity, all of this gets screwed up, and we get lost, and we forget, or we don't realize that determinism and free will, or determinism and choice, are dependent concepts. But that only works within a sentient system, because choice is only a fundamental component of reality, of the construction of reality in a sentient system. And emotion as recognized as an important factor in our orientation and motivation of our logic, is only recognized also in a sentient system. Otherwise, you don't value it, and you just kind of denounce it in a way. Like I've said before, if you don't recognize and incorporate the sentience as the fundamental nature of the system, which is, to not do so is to reject yourself, then you will just spin around. You'll spiral, and you will not orient. It's like spinning in space. You're just trying to pick a point to orient. But there isn't a directionality without goal. So, without sentience, whose goal, So, I thought that was interesting that that just the way there was a mirror to how they were describing things even and asking the questions, but they're both important. They're both necessary. Logic and emotion are not opposed. In fact, my work of trying to dissect unto the first principles of first principles and logically extrapolate and build up from there as meticulously and as what's the word? Not just meticulous, but something as rigorously as I can, has only been able to be done by it's motivated by emotion, and it's only the emotion of humility that keeps you being able to check yourself. It is what allows you to be logical. Even it has to be the right emotion. It can't be the emotion of pride. It has to be the emotion of humility. But it is a requirement. And to thinking rigorously is to feel humbled, and it is your emotion that keeps you interested and fascinated. But sentient singularity theory seems to I don't know what's the right way of putting this, seems to suggest, implies that the logical inevitability of all of this is one of profound and personal meaning, which is a quite an emotional conclusion. You know, it's like, and there you have it. Every complete thought has to start with an emotion, which motivates it, and ends with an emotion. And you could even say that it's inevitable that you will experience emotions along the way of the thought, and therefore it's imperative that you have the right emotions while having the thought, which is humility. But your emotions can sway you off path in that thinking process. You can have pride, and it takes you astray. But anyways, what's up, Torin? Live long and prosper. Meaning to me means eternal, substantive. Helping people feels meaningful because they will remember our deeds. This is why I focus on marriage so much. It's a permanent commitment to being with somebody. You want to feel meaningful, not just in the moment, but like eternally. And that requires eternally impacting someone. And every little deed that we do does eternally impact. But some of them are much more obvious and much more impactful. And they usually take eternal commitments to have eternal impact. Not eternal commitments, infinite impacts. Infinite commitments to have infinite impacts. And, they talk about infinity a bit in here, and I was going to try and get into it because I've talked about it on here before, and I think it's very important it's that, like, infinity this is just the simple way of understanding it in the context of sentient singularity theory. Eternity is a state without time, and that has no beginning and no end. It's a state with no beginning and no end. It's endless and beginningless, which is God. Existence itself is eternal. Existence is eternal. The universe, or the cosmos, is infinite. It had a beginning, and it will have no end. Now, a cosmological verse in sentient singularity theory, which is where we're headed, which is at the end of it, there is an end. There is a maturation point that occurs where then it replicates another universe within itself, but then it does this nested infinitely again and again and again within itself, within itself, within itself. But just if you're going to understand infinity and eternity and finiteness, that which is eternal has no beginning and no end. That which is infinite has a beginning and no end, and that which is finite has a beginning and has an end. And that's it. And it's that simple. There is no infinite as a finite number. Infinity is never-ending growth, but starting from a point, because it's directional. It has a starting point and a directionality to it. Numbers are infinite. Start from 1, go up. But like oneness is eternal, and whereas like quantity, multiplicity is infinite, and so it is a dynamic process. Infinity, in metaphysical or metamathematical sense, it is not a finite number. And when you try and contemplate it like a finite number, it doesn't make any sense, and it just feels beyond you. But it's not. It's just it is a dynamic process of multiplication, and that's it. It's actually remarkably simple. It's super simple to understand. That's the problem with it. It's not that it's so complicated. And eternal is just means like never. It means always existent. It just means with no beginning and no end. If you don't place them into these definitions, I have found that you can't make sense of any of them. But within these definitions, they seem to be pretty coherent. 100% agree. When I consider the emotional range of all animals on Earth, man is probably at the top. Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. But we're also logically at the top. I think we can be both. Like I said, they are dependent concepts. We are the most emotional and the most logical. We're capable of the most emotion and the most logic. Probably. Emotion is feminine, instinctual, materialistic. Logic is masculine, spiritual, apathetic. Together, masculine and spiritual create. Material generates and spirit judges. Kind of. I will say feminine is definitely instinctual. And masculine is definitely logical. Or it's not logical. It's strategic. It's like personally logical, like logical in the moment. Whereas like feminine is instinctual, which is logic across multiplicity of time. Your instincts are still logical, but they're logical in a context that is on the lineage level, not on the individual level. So the masculine logic is on the individual level. Feminine logic is on the instinctual level. Emotion is kind of on the feminine level. Emotion is like on the individual level, and on the masculine, emotion is on the lineage level. In a way, it's like reversed. So it's not that one is logical and one is emotional. It's both of them have logic and both of them have emotion, but it's about application. The masculine is individually logical, but emotional on a lineage level, or instinctual, kind of, or I guess emotional on a lineage level. But feminine is emotional on an individual level, but it's logical on an instinctual lineage level. But it's both there. It's just mirrored. Yeah. So, but do you think mirth would be the rarest emotion? What is mirth? I don't know what that means. My man Wilberg says that infinity does not exist, and if Wilberg thinks it, I believe it. My gullibility is infinite. That's funny. That's funny. Let me look it up. Mirth. Mirth means amusement, especially as expressed with laughter. His 6-foot frame shook with mirth. It's like, it's humor. Hilarity, glee, merriment, jollity. I don't know if it's the rarest, but I've never heard of that term to describe it. And I've been looking for the word to describe humor, the emotion of humor, and mirth seems pretty good. So I appreciate that. That was definitely useful, because I needed a word for it for my model, so I was just using humor, which isn't exactly like work grammatically with where I was trying to use it. But anyways, thank you guys. Please hit the like button. Please share this with anybody who you think might find value in it. Please comment any comments that you have down below. If you would like to join our Discord calls and our Discord community, please private message me on Instagram. Check out my website, sentientsingularity.com. Please hit the bell notification. Also, if you'd like to see the full discussion between Brian Greene and Chris Williamson, the link is in the description, and I'm grateful to both of them for having the discussion that they had, and I'm grateful to you all for joining me and being here. So thank you, everyone, and peace.